So picture the sky over Britain in the early 1940s.
Right in the thick of it.
Exactly. The entire globe is just completely engulfed in the flames and, the sheer catastrophic machinery of the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor still just completely searing the American psyche.
Yeah, and the Allies are, grinding their way through Europe in this incredibly brutal campaign.
Right. And meanwhile, the atomic bomb is quietly being developed on the horizon, getting ready to, literally rewrite the geopolitical landscape of the planet forever.
Absolutely.
Global superpowers are clashing, cities are being reduced to rubble, and the existential threat of totalitarian tyranny is just the daily reality for millions of people.
It's terrifying.
It really is. And right in the middle of this massive historic upheaval, C.S. Lewis, the brilliant Oxford and Cambridge scholar, sits down at his desk.
Yeah.
And he doesn't write some sweeping political manifesto. He doesn't write a military strategy. He writes this tiny, under 100-page booklet about a British grammar textbook.
The sheer audacity of that decision is it's staggering when you really pause to consider the context.
Right.
Because while the whole world is understandably fixated on the immediate tangible threat of global destruction.
Bombs literally falling from the sky.
Exactly. Lewis is looking at the quiet, almost entirely invisible assumptions being fed to school children in their reading assignments.
Wow.
What's fascinating here is how the philosopher Peter Kreeft assesses this. And this is heavily highlighted in the source material we are examining today. Kreeft points out that this little book on education wasn't just a critique of how to teach English literature. He assesses it as a terrifying prophecy.
A prophecy about what, exactly?
Well, not just about the mortality of modern Western civilization, but the mortality of human nature itself.
I mean, that is huge.
It is. Lewis fundamentally believed the philosophical threat hiding inside that mundane classroom textbook was ultimately, more dangerous to the future of humanity than the bombs detonating outside.
That is wild. And that brings us to our mission for you, the listener, today. Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are exploring a sweeping, incredibly thought-provoking argument about how the way we are educated literally shapes what it means to be human.
Yeah.
Our grounding material is this fascinating essay and booklet by Dr. Steve Turley titled Classical versus Modern Education, a Vision from C.S. Lewis.
Right.
And Dr. Turley uses C.S. Lewis's profound 1944 book, The Abolition of Man, to really critique the foundations of modern education and advocate for a return to classical Christian education.
But before we step foot into this philosophical arena, it is so vital to establish some boundaries for how we're going to navigate this material together.
Oh, definitely. We need to be clear about this.
Because the source text we are diving into touches on some highly debated political, cultural, and social issues.
Yeah, very charged stuff.
Right. In channeling Lewis's arguments, Dr. Turley discusses topics like the fundamental flaws of multiculturalism, the morality of abortion, the deep systemic issues within public versus private schooling, and the overreaching nature of the modern state. These are subjects that evoke strong, deeply personal reactions.
Which is why we want to be explicitly clear with you right now. Our role in this deep dive is completely impartial.
Exactly.
We are not taking a left-wing side, nor are we taking a right-wing side. We are not here to endorse the viewpoints of the author, and we aren't here to condemn them either.
Think of us as your museum guides.
Right. We're taking this complex, highly charged source material, placing it in the center of the room, and turning up the light so we can examine its facets together.
We are just here to help you understand the specific arguments, trace the historical connections, and unpack the philosophical logic made in the original text.
Yeah, our goal is to hand you the unvarnished concepts so you can evaluate them and decide for yourself what you actually believe.
Perfect. So the catalyst for this entire philosophical earthquake is astonishingly mundane.
It really is.
It all begins with a standard everyday textbook. Lewis deliberately leaves the actual textbook unnamed in his critique to focus on its ideas rather than its authors. He just refers to it simply as the Green Book.
The Green Book.
Right. And he gives its two authors the rather classical-sounding pseudonyms Gaius and Titius.
Gaius and Titius, they sound like two Roman senators conspiring in the shadows, which is honestly ironically fitting given what Lewis thinks they are doing to the minds of children.
Very fitting.
So Gaius and Titius recount a very famous historical anecdote in this Green Book to teach a lesson. They tell the story of the great English romantic poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge visiting the waterfalls of the Clyde in Scotland. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Picture the raw power of nature. You have roaring, cascading water, the heavy mist hanging in the air.
Just incredible force.
Right, the sheer, unbridled force of the river dropping over the cliff. Coleridge is standing there, completely taking in this magnificent, awe-inspiring sight.
And while he is observing the waterfall, Coleridge overhears two tourists standing nearby, reacting to the exact same phenomenon.
Okay.
The first tourist looks at the roaring water and calls it sublime. The second tourist looks at it and calls it pretty.
Pretty.
Yeah, pretty. Coleridge, steeped in the Romantic era's deep reverence for the majestic power of nature, mentally endorses the first judgment. He deeply agrees the waterfall is sublime.
Makes sense.
And he rejects the second judgment, pretty, with absolute disgust. I mean, calling something with that much cosmic power pretty is a severe underreaction.
It's like standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon and saying, well, that's a nice ditch.
Exactly.
It completely fails to capture the reality of the thing you were looking at. But here is where Gaius and Titius, the textbook authors, step in with their commentary for the students reading this anecdote.
Right, this is the turning point.
They write that when the first tourist said, that is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. But actually, they claim, he was not making a remark about the waterfall at all.
He was only making a remark about his own internal feelings.
Yes. What the tourist was truly saying was, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime.
And Lewis recognizes an incredibly dangerous shift happening in that tiny paragraph.
Because to a kid, it just sounds normal.
Right, to a typical student, this just looks like a slightly pedantic lesson on grammar and psychology. The lesson seems to be, remember kids, your adjectives reflect your internal emotional state.
Right.
But Lewis sees this microscopic moment capturing two completely contrasting human projects. It represents two fundamentally different, incompatible ways of running a civilization.
Wow.
On one side, you have the worldview represented by Coleridge's reaction. This is the classical belief that beauty, goodness, and truth are objective values.
So they actually exist out there in the world.
Exactly. They are firmly embedded in a created cosmic order. The waterfall actually is sublime. It possesses the quality of sublimity, independent of whether anyone is standing there looking at it or not.
So the human being's job in that classical worldview is to recognize that objective reality and align their internal state to match it.
Exactly.
But Gaius and Titius represent the modern belief. They are teaching children that nature is entirely impersonal. It's empty of any inherent value, meaning, or objective qualities.
A blank slate.
Right. Therefore, human beings just project or superimpose their own arbitrary internal feelings onto a blank, meaningless universe.
Yeah.
Beauty isn't in the waterfall. Beauty is just a biological or psychological reaction constructed entirely inside the skull of the observer.
Yes.
Let me jump in with a real-world analogy to test this out, because I want to make sure we're getting this.
Go for it.
If I tell you a pizza I just ate is delicious, and you correct me and say, no, the pizza has no inherent value of deliciousness, you merely have pleasant digestive feelings and chemical reactions occurring in your brain and stomach.
I mean, scientifically.
Scientifically, strictly speaking, you might be right. The pizza is just dough, cheese, and sauce. The deliciousness is my experience of it. But if we leave it there, who really cares? The pizza still tastes good to me. Why does Lewis think applying this subjective framework to a waterfall triggers the collapse of human civilization?
Because the implications go far beyond culinary preferences. And that is precisely where Lewis's alarm bells start ringing.
Okay, lay it out for me.
If you train a child's mind to believe that sublime is just a feeling projected onto a waterfall, the logical machinery doesn't stop there.
It bleeds into other things.
Exactly. What happens when you apply that exact same subjective framework to the concept of justice? What happens when you apply it to courage, or self-sacrifice, or honesty?
Ah, the domino effect.
Consider a soldier who throws himself on a grenade to save his unit. If we use the logic of the Green Book, we have to look at that act and say that sacrifice wasn't inherently courageous or noble.
Because nobility doesn't objectively exist.
Right. The universe doesn't recognize nobility. You, the observer, just have pleasant sociological feelings about group survival instincts, and you are projecting the word courage onto a meaningless biological action.
Man, that's dark.
When you do that, you have fundamentally stripped the moral weight from all human action. Dr. Turley's text highlights that Lewis saw this subjective view as the mechanism that overturns 2,200 years of educational history.
It forcefully marches society out of a moral age. an age built on the pursuit of objective wisdom, and drops us into a purely scientific, modern age where everything is relative.
Precisely.
The source material drives home a massive point here. Education is inescapably enculturation.
Always.
It is the primary vehicle by which a society initiates a young person into a culture, into a specific defined way of being human. The Green Book wasn't just a book teaching grammar. It was a philosophical Trojan horse rolling into the British school system, quietly rewriting the fundamental rules of reality to say everything is subjective.
And Lewis believed this new orientation, where nature is a blank slate and all value is merely a subjective projection, inherently paves the road toward power and manipulation. Well, if objective truth and objective goodness are removed from the equation, the only metric left to organize society is power. Whoever has the most power gets to dictate which subjective feelings are prioritized.
Wow. So, to truly grasp the magnitude of what the text argues was lost in this shift, we have to travel back and understand the classical world.
We do.
Because if this overturned 2,200 years of history, we need to know what that history looked like. How did the classical world, stretching from the era of Plato all the way up to the 19th century, actually view reality and the purpose of education?
The foundation of that 2,200-year history rests on the Greek concept of paideia.
Paideia.
Right. Paideia was the comprehensive educational project of initiating a student into a culture. But it wasn't just about passing down information. It was about shaping the soul to embody a specific way of being human.
The source material makes a really interesting linguistic connection here to the modern word pediatrician. They share that same Greek root, right?
They do. Just as a pediatrician is concerned with the holistic health and healing of a child's physical body, paideia is concerned with the holistic formation of the child's mind, soul, and character.
I love that.
In the Greco-Roman world, paideia possessed a twofold meaning. It was the active, daily educational process of initiating someone, but it also became synonymous with the actual content of that culture itself.
So it's both the verb and the noun.
Exactly. It is the Greek equivalent to the Latin word cultura. It is the intentional cultivation of the human spirit.
And the text points out that this concept doesn't just remain locked in ancient Athens. As history progresses, the early Christians adopt this Greek framework and adapt it for their own purposes.
The adaptation is profound. The text points specifically to the New Testament, to Ephesians 6.4, where St. Paul instructs fathers to raise their children in the paideia of the Lord.
Okay.
Paul takes this universally understood Greco-Roman concept of cultural initiation, but he completely shifts the target. He applies it to a heavenly culture.
So the end goal changes.
Right. The goal of education was no longer simply making a functional Greek citizen who could debate in the forum. The goal was bringing the values, the ethics, and the culture of another world, the world of heaven, into this one through the formation of the student.
But whether we are talking about the classical Greek model or the classical Christian model, this entire educational endeavor was built on a very specific structural view of the universe.
Yeah.
The text calls it the micro-macro relationship. Walk us through that, because this feels like the absolute polar opposite of the modern post-Enlightenment view of a universe made of dead space and floating rocks.
The classical mind operated on a deep, fundamental premise. Humans were microscopic replications of the macrocosmic world.
Okay, so we mirror the universe.
Exactly. They looked at the universe and saw a cosmos overflowing with divine meaning, intentionality, and purpose. And the human being was uniquely designed to mirror that grand cosmic architecture.
The text mentions the 5th century BC philosopher Empedocles to illustrate this connection.
Empedocles is a perfect example of this mindset. He was the philosopher who systematized the 4 fundamental elements of the cosmos: earth, air, fire, and water.
Right.
But he didn't just leave them out there in the universe. He directly connected those cosmic elements to the internal workings of the human body, specifically the 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood.
Okay, from a modern medical perspective, balancing bile and phlegm sounds absolutely terrifying. We've thankfully moved past that.
Oh, medically, it is entirely outdated.
Yeah.
But philosophically, it reveals everything about how they viewed existence. They genuinely believed the internal fluids of your physical body and the composition of your soul were literally intertwined with the physical structure of the universe.
Wow.
The relationships were deeply analogous. You were not a random accident wandering through a cold void. You were an integral, resonant part of a living cosmos.
Because the universe was perceived as being filled with divine meaning, the source argues that you, as a human, were born into a state of what it calls cosmic piety.
Cosmic piety is the logical conclusion of the micro-macro relationship.
Doing what exactly?
If the universe has a divine objective order, you are inherently born into a world of divine obligation. Your primary job, your ultimate existential purpose, is to conform your internal soul to that external cosmic order.
So you adapt to reality, not the other way around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You are only considered fully human to the extent that your intellectual and moral life is in harmonious relationship with the objective reality of the cosmos.
So what does this all mean for a fifth grade math or history class?
That's the real question, isn't it?
Right, because it sounds incredibly lofty to say, Timmy, today we are conforming your soul to the divine cosmic order by learning long division.
Yep.
How did cosmic piety actually translate into reading, writing, arithmetic, and history?
It translated into the idea that no subject is neutral. In this classical model, the paideia of the city-state or the church was designed to reconstitute time and space around this divine obligation.
So every subject matters philosophically.
Every single subject, history, art, literature, mathematics, economics, music, astronomy, was taught as a tangible, material expression of divine meaning.
So mathematics isn't just a utilitarian skill for, balancing a merchant's ledger or calculating tax.
Not at all.
It's about discovering the inherent numerical harmony that the divine order built into the very fabric of reality.
Yes. When a classical student learns music or geometry, they are learning the underlying harmonies of the spheres. They are tracing the fingerprints of the divine.
That is beautiful.
The overarching goal of the educational system was never just to equip a student with mechanical skills so they could secure a job and participate in commerce. The goal was to actively bring about a lasting harmony between the three aspects of the human soul: the intellectual, the moral, and the emotional.
And when those three aspects are harmonized, what is the end product? What kind of person steps out of that educational system?
The end product is an individual capable of living an ethical life of civic virtue. It produces the ideal citizen who loves what is objectively good. This is precisely what C.S. Lewis famously described as producing men with chests.
Men with chests. Let's dig into that.
The chest in Lewis's terminology is the seat of the trained emotions, the part of the soul that bridges the cold intellect of the brain and the raw visceral appetites of the stomach.
Let's hold on that concept of virtue for a moment, because the text points out a fascinating linguistic root regarding the word virtue itself.
The Latin root of the word virtue is vir, which literally translates to man.
Ah.
So classical education was, at its core, a project of humanization. The student was initiated into a culture that materialized this cosmic piety, enabling them to fulfill their divine purpose and thereby become truly, fully a man or fully human. This was not a fringe theory. This was the normative, universally accepted vision of education for over 2 millennia, traveling from Plato through the Roman Empire into the halls of Christendom, and surviving right up until the dawn of the modern scientific era.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because here's where the timeline fractures. You have this beautiful, highly structured, harmonious, classical cosmos. A 2,200-year streak of educating students to conform to objective reality.
Yeah.
And then we hit the 17th century. We hit the breakup of Christendom, the Enlightenment, and the explosive rise of the scientific revolution. And that micro-macro mirror completely shatters.
The fracture fundamentally alters how humanity defines truth. The modern age arrives wielding a brand new rule for what constitutes acceptable knowledge.
A new metric.
Right. It became increasingly plausible, and eventually dominant, to argue that legitimate knowledge should be limited solely to that which could be verified by a specific, rigorous method.
The empirical method. We are talking about the laboratory, the telescope, the microscope.
The new rule of society became,
Yeah.
if a claim can be empirically verified, if it can be proven in a controlled laboratory setting detached entirely from the moral or religious preconceptions of the observer, then it earns the title of objective knowledge.
And if it can't?
If it cannot be subjected to the scientific method, it is automatically demoted to the realm of personal relativity. It is excluded from the arena of public, objective truth.
It becomes just a matter of personal opinion.
Exactly. And this epistemological shift took a massive, destructive toll on the classical worldview. Think about the mechanics of it. You cannot prove cosmic piety in a laboratory.
No, you can't.
You cannot put divine meaning, purpose, or moral obligation under a microscope and observe its cellular structure.
You can't weigh a human soul on a digital scale, and you can't measure the objective, transcendent beauty of a Scottish waterfall with a thermometer.
Right. Because divine meaning and objective value are entirely impervious to the empirical scientific method, they were systematically stripped from the realm of public knowledge.
Just erased.
The universe was no longer seen as a grand design infused with purpose. It came to be viewed as a vast, cold expanse of empty space and raw materials. It was reduced to cause and effect processes, atoms bumping into atoms, possessing no inherent meaning, apart from whatever meaning human beings arbitrarily choose to assign to it.
The source text highlights how this scientific shift completely rewrote the definition and the societal role of religion, too.
It marginalized religion almost completely. Under the classical model, religion was the overarching civilizational expression of cosmic piety. It was the air society breathed.
And now?
But under the modern empirical rule, religion became nothing more than a private feeling. It became something you might personally believe in your own home, but it is not something you can know in the rigorous scientific sense of the word.
Wow.
It might provide you with personal psychological comfort, but it holds zero public objective value. Consequently, the church, and religious morality in general, gets pushed completely out of the public square and is consigned solely to the private, subjective life of the individual.
The text points out that this historical shift creates a massive inversion of the fundamental question of humanity. For the classical person, the driving question of their entire life was, how do I conform my soul to reality?
Yes.
But for modern man, standing in an empty, meaningless universe, the question completely inverts to, how do I conform the world to my desires?
And the psychological impact of that inversion cannot be overstated. You are now born into a world totally devoid of any divine obligation, apart from whatever arbitrary rules you choose to impose on yourself.
You're on your own.
You no longer have to submit your desires to the cosmos. Instead, you're encouraged to use the tools of technology, science, and industry to aggressively bend the cosmos to serve whatever you happen to want.
This brings us directly to the source's critique of modern culture and how we even use the word culture today. Because the world is now viewed as inherently meaningless, the word culture itself morphs. The text argues it becomes a sterile social science term.
It becomes a term used by anthropologists and sociologists to describe the artificial symbols, behavioral practices, and structural arrangements that different populations use to fabricate a sense of meaning.
Because it's not real.
Right. Since the universe provides no inherent meaning, humans are forced to invent it from scratch. And this leads the text to a very specific, critical conclusion about the modern concept of multiculturalism.
Right. The text argues that this modern relativistic view leads directly to multiculturalism, which it defines in this specific context as the idea that all cultures are equally valid simply because they are all equally artificial.
There is no objective standard to judge one culture against another because they're all just made-up meaning systems superimposed on a meaningless void.
Okay, I need to interject here and test the boundaries of this argument.
Please do.
I'm listening to this sweeping critique of the modern scientific age, and I'm thinking, okay, we lost cosmic piety and the music of the spheres, but didn't this modern shift, this relentless focus on the empirical and the scientific method, give us modern medicine?
It certainly did.
Didn't it give us electricity, indoor plumbing, the internet, and the advanced agricultural technology required to feed billions of people? Isn't conforming the physical world to our needs actually a profound moral good? Given the choice, I would much rather have access to antibiotics and sterile surgery than a philosophy about balancing my four humors.
This raises an important question, and the tension you are highlighting is crucial. It is vital to carefully clarify what Lewis and the source text are actually arguing.
Okay.
Lewis is not anti-science. He is not a Luddite advocating that we abandon antibiotics and return to the Dark Ages. He fully recognizes the immense practical benefits of the scientific revolution.
So what's the problem?
What he is warning against is the philosophical reductionism that accompanied it. The existential danger arises when society becomes so obsessed with empirical data that it entirely cuts students off from the true, the good, and the beautiful as objective, transcendent realities.
Because if we sever that connection, we lose the foundational source of civic virtue.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can have a society equipped with the most advanced, miraculous technology imaginable. But if everything in that society is purely subjective, if morality is reduced to a menu of personal preferences, how do you sustain this civilization itself?
You don't.
What invisible force keeps people acting ethically, cooperating, and sacrificing for one another when it is not in their immediate biological self-interest to do so?
Which brings us to what the text calls the tragic comedy of modern expectations. Let's look at a concept the source borrows from St. Augustine, ordo amoris, or the ordering of our loves.
Yes, I love this part.
The source uses this amazing, slightly absurd, but perfectly illustrative analogy. It says, it's good to love a baby, and it's good to love a ham sandwich.
Both are legitimate goods in the world. They both have value in their proper context.
Right. But if both the baby and the ham sandwich somehow fall off a ledge at the exact same time, and I rush over and choose to save the ham sandwich while letting the baby fall, my loves are wildly, dangerously out of order.
Saving the sandwich demonstrates that your internal values have been completely dislodged from the objective economy of goods.
Because obviously the baby is more important.
Right. You have failed to recognize the transcendent reality that a human life objectively holds infinitely more value than a piece of lunch meat. The classical educational model was designed entirely to prevent that misordering of loves.
And without that cosmic standard, without an objective understanding of what is good with a capital G, the text argues that the human soul inevitably collapses into one of two extremes. It cannot hold the middle ground.
It splits.
Let's explore the first extreme.
The first extreme the soul collapses into is unethical rationalism. When you decouple human reason from objective transcendent morality, you are left with pure, cold, utilitarian logic.
Okay.
And pure logic, unrestrained by the concept of sacred human dignity, can justify horrific things. The text explicitly cites the example of Peter Singer, the highly influential bioethics professor at Princeton University, to demonstrate this.
Let's walk through this carefully because the jump from subjective reality to the example cited here is very heavy, and we need to understand the logical steps the text is tracing.
We must trace the logic exactly as the text presents it to understand the critique. If you start with the modern premise that there is no objective, divinely ordained value to human life, then the value of a person must be calculated by something else.
Like what?
In utilitarian ethics, value is often determined by the capacity for preference satisfaction, the ability to have conscious desires and experience suffering or pleasure. The text points out that Singer has famously argued from this purely rationalist perspective.
Okay.
He concludes that if a newborn infant, or even a toddler up to a certain age, the text mentions up to age 2, lacks the cognitive capacity for self-awareness and preference satisfaction, then it lacks the strict criteria for personhood.
Wow.
Therefore, under certain circumstances, if the parents choose it and it maximizes overall well-being, post-birth abortion or infanticide, can be deemed ethically permissible.
So the text is showing that this isn't the result of malice, it's the result of airtight, modern rationalism operating in a vacuum devoid of the classical sense of inherent objective human dignity.
Precisely.
It's the ultimate expression of the intellect disconnected from the chest. So that is the extreme of unethical rationalism. What is the alternative extreme the soul collapses into?
The alternative is unthinking sensualism. If there is no higher transcendent meaning to aspire to, and if pure rationalism feels too cold, the only thing left for the human animal to pursue is base biological pleasure.
Because nothing else matters.
Right. The text points to the radical pornification of modern pop culture as the primary evidence of this. It argues this cultural descent is totally predictable.
How so?
If you systematically cut a society off from the transcendent, the academic intelligentsia will naturally drift toward becoming radically unethical rationalists, and the pop culture icons and the masses will drift toward becoming radically sensual.
So society splits in two.
Exactly. What you lose entirely is the middle ground.
Yeah.
You lose the balanced soul. You lose the men with chests.
And this leads to arguably the most famous, devastating quote from Lewis's The Abolition of Man. I want to read this verbatim because the rhetoric hits so incredibly hard.
Go ahead.
Lewis writes, "We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful."
It is a sweeping, deeply penetrating critique of modern hypocrisy.
Let me just speak directly to you, the listener, for a moment, to apply this tragic comedy to the headlines we see every single day, based on the framework of the text. Think about it.
Yeah, consider the real world.
We sit students in classrooms for 12 years and implicitly or explicitly teach them that truth is relative, that morality is just a socially constructed mechanism for power. But then we turn on the evening news and we expect our politicians to act with objective honesty.
Which makes no sense.
We teach situational ethics in our universities, where right and wrong completely depend on the fluid circumstances, but then we get absolutely furious when Wall Street bankers act on their own situational greed and crash the global economy.
Exactly.
We academically deconstruct the concept of the family as an arbitrary, oppressive construct, but we still expect the planet to organically repopulate and local communities to flourish. Lewis is pointing out that we are literally surgically removing the organ of virtue and then furiously demanding that society continue to perform the function of virtue.
We are demanding the very qualities we are structurally making impossible through our educational assumptions. But this leads Lewis to a very dark, pragmatic realization.
Which is?
If we have successfully destroyed objective morality, if people no longer possess a built-in compass of cosmic piety guiding them to autonomously do the right thing, society still faces a massive logistical problem.
What's the problem?
You still need a way to keep people in line. You cannot run a complex global civilization on pure relativistic anarchy.
Right. So if no one agrees on what objective goodness is, and you can't appeal to a shared moral reality, how do you achieve social order?
According to Lewis's prophecy, the only tools left in the toolbox are coercion and manipulation.
And this launches us into the most terrifying dystopian aspect of Lewis's thesis. If objective goodness is gone, you can't appeal to someone's conscience by saying, do this because it is the right thing to do.
No, you can't.
The source material brings in a brilliant analogy here using The Lord of the Rings, which of course was written by Lewis's close friend and academic colleague at Oxford, J.R.R. Tolkien.
As friends.
Right. Picture the climax of the story. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee are grueling their way toward Mordor to destroy the ring. They are starving, terrified, and physically broken. And Sam delivers this beautiful, iconic speech where he looks at Frodo and says, "There is some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for."
That moment is a classic, pure expression of belief in objective value. Sam is acknowledging a transcendent goodness that exists entirely outside of his own temporary feelings of fear and exhaustion, and he is willing to suffer and die to preserve it.
Now, apply the modern educational framework to that scene. Imagine if Samwise Gamgee had been educated by Gaius Anticius using the Green Book.
Oh, wow.
Imagine Sam genuinely believes that the concept of good is just a subjective evolutionary feeling causing a chemical reaction in his brain. How in the world do you motivate a subjective relativist Sam to walk into the nightmare of Mordor?
You really can't. Because you can no longer appeal to his inherent sense of virtue, you have to resort to consequentialism.
Meaning you just bribe or threaten him.
Exactly. To get the behavior you want, you have to change the external consequences. You have to say, Sam, if you don't take this ring to Mount Doom, I am going to kidnap your family in the Shire.
Just raw extortion.
Or, conversely, you have to offer an overwhelmingly massive bribe. Sam, if you go to Mordor, I will guarantee you 1,000,000 gold coins and a life of luxury. You are forced to manipulate him through either brute extortion or extreme reward. You have to meticulously control his environment and his incentives to force the physical behavior you require.
Because you can't rely on him autonomously choosing the good. This systemic need for control leads to the creation of what the text ominously calls the new aristocracy.
We have to remember that the modern summum bonum, the highest overarching good of the scientific age, is the conquest of nature. Modern man wants to conquer the natural world to serve his own endless desires.
Sure.
But to achieve this massive technologically complex project of conquering nature, while simultaneously managing a society that lacks objective moral cohesion, you inevitably bifurcate humanity. You create two distinct classes of people.
The manipulators and the manipulated. Or, as Lewis categorizes them in The Abolition of Man, the conditioners and the conditioned.
The conditioners are the new elite. They are the social engineers, the behavioral psychologists, the technocrats, the policymakers. They're the small group of people sitting behind the curtain, pulling the levers of society.
And what about the rest of us?
And they managed to get the masses, the conditioned, to go along with this massive behavioral modification by promising them everything they desire. The conditioners promise life without limit. They promise pharmacological, psychological wellness. They promise endless material prosperity and the protection of various group rights.
It's like signing up for a massively popular free app on your phone that promises to organize your life perfectly.
Exactly like that.
It tracks your caloric intake, it manages your daily schedule, it monitors your REM sleep, it tells you when to drink water. It is incredibly convenient and makes you feel optimized.
But there's a cost.
Right. But the hidden, Unspoken cost of that convenience is that the app is constantly harvesting every single data point of your existence. It uses that data to predict your actions, to sell your psychological profile to advertisers, and to subtly alter your feed to control your consumer behavior.
You think you are empowered by this technology.
You feel like the master of your life, but you are actually the raw product being meticulously managed by the developers in Silicon Valley.
That is a flawless modern translation of Lewis's fear. The insidious genius of this system is that it successfully enslaves the masses by convincing them that relying entirely on the social engineers is the very definition of freedom.
It's terrifying.
The source text points to a very specific, real-world example to highlight this irony. It notes that the state of Maryland's electronic benefit transfer card, the EBT card used for public food and cash assistance, which makes a citizen dependent on the state, is officially named the Independence Card.
The Orwellian irony there is incredibly thick.
The text highlights that specific naming convention as perfectly indicative of the modern mindset. Your freedom and independence are increasingly contingent on the extent to which you are dependent on the behavioral management of the social engineers.
But the text takes this logic one step further, pushing into a very controversial and chilling conclusion about the endgame of the conditioner.
Yeah, this gets dark.
If the great project of the modern age is man's absolute conquest of nature, who exactly is the nature being conquered?
The text asserts a terrifying paradox. Man's conquest of nature ultimately results in treating humanity itself as nature, to be conquered and controlled. The vast, overwhelming majority of the human population gets conceptually downgraded and consigned to the category of biological raw material.
So the conditioners look out at the masses of citizens not as immortal souls imbued with divine dignity and purpose, but simply as a natural resource to be managed, pruned, and directed.
Precisely. And the text argues this underlying philosophy is the driving, unseen force behind major cultural battles, specifically citing widespread contraception and abortion.
How does the text connect those?
The text posits that from the perspective of the conditioners, these technologies are not primarily about individual women's rights. Rather, they are structural mechanisms that allow the elites to literally control and conquer human nature at its biological root. The text suggests that a certain class of modern elites views abortion as a more sacred right than, for example, the Second Amendment, precisely because it represents the ultimate triumph over nature. It is the pinnacle expression of the modern summum bonum taking control over the very generation of human life.
We are kneading, cutting, and shaping humanity into entirely new configurations for the pleasure and the grand designs of the masters. This is the literal meaning behind Lewis's title, The Abolition of Man.
Yes, the abolition of humanity itself.
If you strip away the objective values, if you destroy the Tao, the universal moral law, as he sometimes called it, you do not get a society of liberated, free-thinking humans. You get a society of biological machines being programmed by whichever group of conditioners happens to currently hold the levers of power.
And this leads to the final, fatal flaw in the conditioners' utopia.
What's that?
Because the conditioners themselves are products of this modern education. They also do not believe in objective morality. So what guides their decisions?
If they don't believe in right or wrong.
Exactly. When they are sitting at the control panel of society, what dictates which levers they pull? It cannot be virtue. It can only be their own natural impulses, their own arbitrary subjective desires.
So humanity is ultimately abolished, replaced by a tiny fraction of masters acting purely on whim and a vast population of slaves acting entirely on conditioning.
That is the fear.
Okay, if modern culture is essentially functioning as a giant societal Skinner box, deliberately cutting us off from transcendent values and turning us into manageable data points for technocratic social engineers, I am sure you, listening right now, might be feeling a sense of existential dread.
I wouldn't blame you.
You might be wondering if the only logical response is to cash out your savings, buy a concrete bunker in the woods, and learn how to pickle your own root vegetables.
Start a farm.
Right. But we're going to pivot sharply here because the source material actually takes a very strong, documented turn toward optimism. It argues that a significant renaissance is currently happening.
The text outlines a highly organized, growing counter-movement. It is not just theoretical doom and gloom. There is actionable, measurable hope rising in response to this crisis.
The source shares some incredible specific statistics outlining the rapid renaissance of classical Christian education over the last 3 decades. And I want to get into the details of these numbers because they show a profound grassroots hunger for a completely different way of shaping the next generation.
The data the text provides is striking. It notes that the Association of Classical Christian Schools, which is just one metric of this movement, grew from a mere 10 affiliated schools in 1994 to over 230 schools at the time the data was compiled.
And the enrollment in those schools doubled in just a single decade, surging from 17,000 to over 35,000 students.
Meta.
But what is it that these schools are actually doing differently? Why are parents pulling their kids out of standard modern education to put them here?
They are returning to the classical trivium, the three stages of grammar, logic, and rhetoric.
Okay, what does that actually look like?
Instead of just teaching disjointed facts for a standardized test, they are teaching students how to think critically, how to identify logical fallacies, and how to articulate truth persuasively. They are reintroducing the reading of the great historical texts, immersing students in Latin.
Latin, really?
Yes, and most importantly, teaching every subject as interconnected and pointing toward an objective, divine reality. And what's notable is the academic outcome of this philosophical shift.
Do they actually perform better?
The text points out that in 2011, students educated in these classical schools achieved the highest SAT scores across all measured school types, beating out standard independent private schools, traditional religious schools, and public schools.
So this is not just a philosophical retreat into the woods. This methodology is producing highly capable, intellectually rigorous students. The text mentions Tall Oaks Classical School in Delaware specifically, noting how it caught the attention of the secular media. A local mainstream magazine ran a feature article basically looking at the data and saying, we might disagree with their theology, but we absolutely cannot ignore the undeniable success story happening in these classrooms.
And this renaissance is not limited to traditional brick-and-mortar private schools. The text highlights a massive concurrent surge in the homeschooling movement.
Right.
Between the years 1999 and 2009, homeschooling saw an explosive 74% increase. Families are taking the payday of their children back into their own living rooms. It is moving from a fringe, countercultural choice to a significant mainstream educational pathway.
Beyond just the localized growth of classical schools and home educators, the text points to broader systemic, political, and cultural movements aligning with this shift. It mentions the growing school choice movement.
It specifically references the efforts of former Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal, who pushed legislative efforts to shift public monopoly funding to allow parents to use voucher programs to send their children to private and Christian schools.
Interesting.
The core argument here is about breaking the state's monopoly on education and returning the power to parents, allowing them to intentionally choose the specific paideia their children are initiated into.
And the skepticism of the modern educational monopoly is bleeding heavily into mainstream pop culture as well. The text references major documentaries that have aggressively exposed the systemic flaws in public education, like the film Waiting for Superman.
Which the text is very careful to note was directed by Davis Guggenheim, the same filmmaker who produced Al Gore's environmental documentary An Inconvenient Truth.
So not exactly a conservative figurehead.
Right. The text points this out to prove that this is not just a partisan right-wing critique of the education system. There is a broad, bipartisan societal recognition that the current industrialized model of modern education is profoundly failing students.
Wow.
The text also mentions another critical documentary called Indoctrination, which traces the historical roots of the modern public education monopoly, highlighting its deliberately secular, statist agenda from its inception.
Okay, so the text establishes that there is real momentum, there is a renaissance, but what can you, the listener, actually do with this information today? Is this deep dive just an interesting hour of philosophical theory, or does the author provide practical, boots-on-the-ground steps?
The text concludes with two very specific, actionable directives. First, if you are a parent of school-age children, you must soberly and intentionally choose which vision of culture you want your kids initiated into.
Because neutrality is a myth.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to wake up to the reality that education is never neutral. It is always enculturation. You're either actively choosing a classical model that points your child's soul toward objective truth, or you are passively defaulting to a modern model that points them towards subjective relativism and the rule of the conditioners.
And the second directive is aimed at people who aren't currently parents of young kids. Maybe you are single, or maybe you are a grandparent whose kids are grown.
The text urgently calls on those individuals to utilize their resources to set up scholarship funds.
Because it's not cheap.
No. Building and sustaining classical education can be incredibly expensive for young families.
Yeah.
The author argues that setting up trusts, Donating to existing schools or working with local churches to help financially strapped families afford this kind of education is one of the most magnificent, impactful contributions you can make to the recovery of civic virtue in our civilization.
It is essentially funding the cultural resistance. It
Mm,
is putting your resources toward the deliberate cultivation of men with chests.
exactly.
The text closes this entire argument with a brilliant quote from the 19th century English art critic John Ruskin, and I think it perfectly, beautifully summarizes what the classical education renaissance is ultimately aiming for.
Let's hear it.
Ruskin says, "The entire object of true education is to make people not merely do the right things, but enjoy the right things, not merely industrious, but to love industry, not merely learned, but to love knowledge, not merely pure, but to love purity, not merely just, but to hunger and thirst after justice."
That quote brings us full circle, right back to St. Augustine's concept of ordo amoris.
The ordering of loves.
It is about the intentional ordering of the loves. Ruskin is reminding us that true education is never just about behavioral modification or passing a test. It is the profound project of teaching the human soul to deeply love what is objectively good.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We started this deep dive looking at two guys arguing over whether a Scottish waterfall was sublime or just pretty, and by pulling that single thread, we ended up uncovering two entirely different colliding ways of running a human civilization.
Yeah, quite the journey.
One worldview looks out at the universe, sees a divine objective reality, and demands that the human soul submit and align itself with that standard.
And the other worldview, the grand modern experiment, strips the universe of all inherent meaning. It attempts to forcefully bend reality to human will, eventually handing control over to a small class of conditioners and risking the total abolition of our very humanity in the process.
We've covered the deep history, the philosophical mechanics, the dire warnings, and the actionable hope presented in Dr. Turley's analysis of C.S. Lewis. But as always, we want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your week. Something that builds on the foundation we've laid today, but looks toward the future.
When C.S. Lewis was writing in 1944, his primary terror was focused on human elites, human conditioners using the tools of science, state education, and propaganda to manipulate the masses.
Right.
But today, we are standing on the precipice of a completely unprecedented reality. As we rapidly and willingly hand over our daily decisions, our educational paradigms, our cultural curation, and the entirety of our behavioral data to artificial intelligence and complex algorithms, we have to ask ourselves a terrifying new question. What happens when the conditioners who are shaping our reality, feeding us our news, and meticulously manipulating our desires aren't even human anymore?
Man.
Have we, in our pursuit of technological convenience, built the ultimate, inescapable green book? And if we have, how in the world do you teach an algorithm cosmic piety?
That is a deeply chilling thought to leave on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems operating around you. Keep actively seeking the sublime. And remember, the next time you stand in front of a majestic waterfall, some things really are objectively beautiful.